Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 36, our guest today is Suzy Donovan, and we talked to her about her ancestry and some of her family that is from the North Fork, as well as her time through school and her career as a journalist, and about her time moving back to Greenport and what she thinks of the area today and some of the opportunities and issues that Greenport is going through. This episode was recorded March 22nd, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I'd like to start off with just give us a little introduction about yourself and where you were born and raised.
Okay. Well, my formal name is Marguerite Suzanne Donovan, and I say that because I was named after my grandma, Marguerite Horton. But most people growing up here, and I spent all of my summers here, know me as Suzy. So here in Greenport, I go by Suzy Donovan. I was actually born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My mom's side of the family is my Greenport connection, and she was part of the Horton family, Captain Harry Horton. But by the time I came along, she and my father were in Pittsburgh and then moved when I was fairly young to just north of Philadelphia. So what we would do is I went to school there, and my family would come out here and spend our summers at Grandma and Grandpa's house. And then when we got a little older and a little too wild for Harry Horton's taste, we stayed in various cabins all around the East End, which was great fun. So, But mostly we were at their house on 4th Street.
Wow. For your mom's side of the family, how far back can you go in terms of your ancestry?
Right. So my grandfather was Harry A. Horton, and we all knew him, and he was known in the community as Captain Horton. But I've learned through a little bit of digging and looking at old census records that his daddy was Bartlett Horton. And I haven't been able to go back too much further, although obviously there are other Hortons going back. But Bartlett Horton was in Patchogue. And he brought his family out here somewhere in the mid-1800s. And Harry had, I want to say, 3 or 4 siblings. They all made their living on the water. He had one sister. She did not, but she married into oystermen as well. But they moved to 5th Street. And I want to say it was in the early 1900s when Harry was able to get some property on 4th Street on Widow's Hole and built his home there. So again, I don't have an exact date for that, but that's as far back as I've been able to go. So the sort of strain of Hortons that I'm part of, that are my kin, are folks out of Patchogue, and they were all very much working people. When you look at the census records, it's interesting. I've looked over the years, and at one point, Bartlett was also named or used the term painter. So he may have been house painting at the time. And sometimes I've learned that in those early census records, people were almost sort of making things up. But, just depending on who was asking and that kind of thing. But when you look at the records going down, very quickly changed to sort of a generic term called oysterman. And I read that as, people who were, and in my case, my family, making their living on the water. And Harry Horton certainly was that. He also later in life he served in the U.S. Navy. Out here he made his living by fishing, but also a diverse range of roles. He through the 30s he made it by piloting some yachts for very wealthy people. Which was very fun to discover. It's just a whole other piece of him that I didn't know about as a child. And then he always fished for his family. My mother has stories of how much she hated eel because through the winter, that's partly how they made it. And he would dry eel in the basement. And she just, she has these stories about, how oily they were and
the smell.
The smell, exactly, which I could almost feel the way she would talk about it. Mm-hmm. I, for instance, have never eaten eel. And I think my mother imprinted that on me from a fairly early age. But, he knew how to catch anything. He speared eel. He got them, he lived just an extraordinary life, literally right, on the water. And he was right on Widow's Hole. So, but he also ran and owned what were called party boats. So he got licensed to charter and bring people out. And he did that largely out of Montauk. Mm-hmm. So he really knew the waters out here on both sides, and was known as a very safe operator. There are stories of certain captains that would overload their boats and some very devastating accidents that happened out in the waters as a result of that. But Harry was known as somebody who was a safe operator and would only allow a limit of folks. But he did that for a number of years. And one of his boats that many people might recall was the Striper. And that boat lived on in many iterations for years and years. And I think it's finally been retired, essentially. But he also owned a boat. So by the time I came around, the boat that was right behind our house in Widow's Hole, because there used to be docks sitting out there. And we had one, Harry did, and it was the Big Bill. And that was the boat. And they were beautiful old wooden vessels, So we learned, and he also had wooden rowboats. So we would go out and row and, get crab and, all of the things that, as a kid, it was just an extraordinary way to be a part of the bay, experience here. And very different for me. So, again, I said I essentially grew up and went to school in just north of Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And it was an environment that was essentially a suburban / moving into urban kind of environment at a time when, things were changing and there was more money in the economy and all that. And we would come out here for the summer and it was, literally a different world. And I can recall driving out before there was an LIE, and really it had the feel of entering a different time and a different place. And it was, So when you grow up in a suburban environment, not a lot of nature is around. We weren't near water, and we'd come out here, and it was like the vistas, just the open land, and then the sea itself were so powerful. And to me, getting to spend time in a village where everybody knew my grandparents and their father and their sisters and brothers and all of that, it was nothing like being in a suburban area. People don't know one another. And even early on in suburban, U.S., north of Philly, you didn't really know your neighbors as well. So coming out here, it was completely different. And we were able to just run free. And everybody, again, they knew Harry and Marge, Marguerite. She, taught school in Greenport. She taught third grade. And it just felt like home. I mean, even though it was our, if you will, summer home. And I think that has a lot to do with the house itself, because Harry built it, and feeling a sense of home here that I did not feel in the suburban environment.
Yes. And that your grandfather built the house. Or he went to school through Greenport?
He probably did. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
My mom graduated in 39, and I have not been able to go back and look at earlier, high school records for him. But yeah, I'm about 100% certain because, again, according to the census records, he was young enough. I mean, heck, I want to say he was probably between like 7 and 9 when his daddy Bartlett moved them out here to Greenport. So I assume that, this is where he went to school. I never learned. I think he must have graduated because at any rate, I'm pretty certain he did, but I don't know when.
But you used to come out and visit them. What was that time frame, kind of? How long did you do that?
Well, we knew no other vacation. So I was born in 1956, and we started coming out here early. I would say certainly in the early 60s. So I literally spent every summer coming out here. And by the time I was probably 14 or 15, started working. So all of my summer jobs were out here. My very first job was at the Townsend Manor Inn as a busgirl. I also worked at Claudio's. And those are the years where the waitresses, who were all wonderful, wonderful people, they were there. That was their job for much of their adult lives. And so I really looked up to them, at that time in my life. I just wanted to be a great busgirl. And I loved that work. It made me feel very much, again, a part of something that was so different from what I was experiencing during the regular, if you will, school year. But they were wonderful restaurants. They were very popular. On a Friday and Saturday and Sunday, there were lines out the door. And it was just a lot of locals and, of course, a lot of visitors coming in. It was a summer, always sort of a summer environment and tourist sort of economy. But those were great jobs. So I spent my summers doing that. And then as I got a teeny bit older, I want to say 16 or so, I moved over to working at the Coronet, which was, it's now called Crazy Beans, but it was a wonderful corner breakfast lunch place.
Yes.
And it was the place that all of the downtown business people and our community leaders would come early in the morning. The fishermen also came in. They opened at like 6 a.m. And guys would come in, mostly guys, and get their lunch. And, so it was crazy busy, like from the time you open the doors. Yes. But they had, and they still do, these wonderful counters. And our, community people would all come in and sit down and just spend about an hour or so. It always felt like an hour. It's probably more like 30 minutes, but, gossiping about the town. And, really it was all of the folks who were part of the business, core businesses of Greenport, our barber, our insurance people, our mayor, our, anybody who had, any business or business to do downtown, would come into the Coronet and sit down and have coffee and a roll or whatever. So you got to know everyone.
Yes. It was kind of the hangout spot, especially in the morning and maybe around lunchtime.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And a lot of guys would take, coffee break at like 10 o'clock. So they might come in the morning and then come back in and hang out. And, it was just again, what I loved about it was everybody was connected. And, everybody who came in, and whether they liked each other or not, that's not the point. You knew who didn't like one another, where the rivalries were, all that business. But, they all knew each other. And they all had great stories that they were telling all the time. And, it was just a really warm, sort of open environment where people would hang out and learn about what was happening. And that's how the buzz, and of course this is way pre-internet. So,
Yes.
Places like the Coronet and the Paradise was here as well, that lunch place.
Did you work there?
No, I never worked at Paradise, although I loved it. I always loved it. It was just a beautiful the layout of that place was incredible. And that's where you hung out. Like all the high school kids that I got to know from Greenport High, that's where everybody went for, French fries and Coke. So, and I had a lot of those buddies because we all knew each other from the summertime. So when I would come out in the fall, which we would do, periodically for weekends and stuff like that, I would hang out with them and go to the football games and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just to go back a bit, did you talk to your grandparents about Greenport, and did they ever tell you any stories or things about what they did? Well, I mean, they told you what they did for work, but like any other stories about Greenport, or maybe?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I didn't ask them for a lot of Greenport stories. And part of that, I think, was that the relationship was such that Harry in particular was a fairly rigid man, very loving and very sort of hardscrabble stock kind of guy. He wasn't a warm and fuzzy kind of guy. Grandma, Marge, was a classic grandma. She baked and she made all kinds of delightful things. And, but, at the time, I didn't really even think to ask them about Greenport stories. Like, we would come out here and me and my sister and brother, we would just go out, and I refer to us as sort of feral children. That's before everybody was so concerned about security issues and that kind of thing. We'd go out and we'd be gone all day.
Yes.
All day. And, we'd be out in our little boats. We'd be going to beaches. We'd be hanging out with friends, all of that. And so, at the time in my life when that would have made sense, to stop for a minute and say, hey, like, Grandpa, how did you do that? Right? But he did invite me into his life insofar as, he taught me fishing, and he taught me how to row, and he taught me crabbing. So I was part of his experience in that way, and that's how he gave, was to share his love of the water. And they were also, just sideways, very staunch Methodists. And so that was a whole other piece of the upbringing and sort of who they were. They weren't people who talked a lot about themselves.
Yeah.
They weren't sort of self-conscious. They just were in their work and their lives and moving forward. And I got a lot from that. In terms of, I think as a kid, you pick up things like what it means to be here. And one of the big messages I got was you work, and you're part of your community. It's really important to be in that fabric and to participate and to think of the broader community as family, in a sense, whether you like them or not, because one thing about Greenport that I did understand very early on, because they did periodically talk about the storms out here, was understanding that life here was as much defined by our weather and environment as anything, as much as it was by the farm fields and that kind of thing. And maybe it was more present for Grandpa and Grandma because they literally right on the water, and that's, he was out there every day. I mean, that's what he did. But I really got a sense of the environment as sort of an extension of the village itself and what it meant to be here. And that the very landscape that we were in was something that you had to learn how to navigate, how to be a part of in a, I would say, respectful way. But it was as much, again, a part of my sense of Greenport and its identity as the village and the buildings and the families itself, sort of an extension of that.
And then just, could you talk a little bit about your father's side of the family and just their ancestry and where they came from?
Yeah, my dad and mom met in New York City. They both went to school, and they were interning as social workers. So they both became social workers. He later went back to school and got some kind of a master's in business. But he so I say that because they were by the time my mother was, when she graduated from college, and she went to college herself too, she went into New York City, like probably many people, right? She wanted to be in the big city. And so that's where she met him. His name is Bill Donovan. And his family were Irish. They were, he was the first generation born here. So his mom was from the County Cavan in Northern Ireland, and his daddy was from Limerick in the South. And my understanding was that they met in New York. He was, my father's father was very much I don't know that he was part of the ward healer system, but he was very much part of the Irish network. So when families came in, he made sure that people had groceries and places to live and that kind of thing. Very much a part of that fabric of New York and the immigrant experience. And so that's how my dad grew up, was learning and watching that. And again, so he and my mom met, and then he started coming out here as well. But, did
your father say why his parents came over? Did his father come over by himself?
Poverty, yeah. I mean, just very, very poor. I had the great privilege of, in 1989, going to Ireland by myself. And I went to Northern Ireland and was able to track down the home that my grandma was born in. And, some of my relatives there, generational cousins and this and that, like, second cousins, that kind of thing, were still sort of around. I mean, they were literally still living with dirt floors. And it was, very, very hard life. So when they came here, it was to try to make their lives, basically. And grandma on my dad's side worked in retail her whole life. I want to say it was like Lord and Taylor's in New York City.
Yeah.
And my father's father, I can't remember right now what he did, but I'll remember. But he was a worker.
Yeah.
I mean, he really was. So my father was, in many ways, a real classic first gen, in that he, they made sure he went to a good Catholic school in New York. And that once he served in the war, and unfortunately his father died when my dad was serving in the Pacific. So he never got to see him. He died of TB, tuberculosis. But my dad really, he was sort of given the mandate and I think the motivation to really change his circumstances, so he went to college, and of course he had the great fortune of the GI Bill, all that business, and was able to go on and get a master's degree. So it's like his life was so radically different, from what his parents had grown up with, obviously.
Yes.
And I was, again, I would say sort of a result of that privilege. Our family was able to benefit from all of that history. And frankly, the public money of the GI Bill, all those things, all those pieces went into us being able to have, and him moving into a corporate job. He was in labor relations by the time he was older, and, and making a decent amount of money. And so, I'm very conscious of that. My dad also, like many, again, first generation immigrants, families, he was very closed mouth about, his own experience. And also he and my mother, of course, grew up during the Depression. So that had, its own effect on people, as you can well imagine. And I often have felt that, because they understood that kind of poverty, it was so important for them to be able to give. And so for us, there was never any question, that we would go on to college, and which again was a very different experience from many of the friends that I had here in Greenport, for instance. That's the reason I even raised that, so I felt like back to my original point, I lived in sort of two different worlds. That where I understood what was happening. I was very conscious of the fact that we had this privilege, and in large measure because I had this Greenport experience. It was very different to be here and spend summers, and everyone I knew here was doing hard work. I mean, 2 and 3 jobs just to be here. And again, that's what I grew up with, is grandma and grandpa, So it was, I think it gave me a really interesting, sort of foundation, but a world that I guess I'll say I understood a couple of things. One is, what it means to have those resources, but also the very big difference between growing up in a place where your environment is as much an important part of the world that you're in as your education, for instance, or, the things that, we come to value.
Yes. And then just a little bit about your mother. So she grew up in Greenport, and how did she ever say what she did for fun as a child, or?
Oh. My mother's funny. So yeah, she did. And I mentioned earlier, she graduated in 1939 from Greenport. I think her life also, Grandma and Grandpa were, I mentioned, could be somewhat strict.
Yeah.
So my sense is that Harry absolutely, would take her out when she was younger, and she loved the water, and she also learned to sail at a very young age, and that was really important to her. Swimming, huge. I mean, when she went to college, she was at University of North Carolina and on the women's swim team, and that was a huge part of her experience. But they were also at a time just on the cusp where to be a young woman meant that you had to be very much more reserved than certainly when I grew up, thank God. So my mother has, she had some very mixed stories and feelings about, that period. And there were times when, she basically had to come home from school and just sort of sit quietly and read for a while. And she was much more of a tomboy. So she chafed at that, I will say.
Were her parents okay with her going to college?
Yes. I think they, that was, they also saw that as an important development and understood. My mother, I would call her sort of more of a bohemian, independent spirit. She was a poet. She wrote beautifully about the landscape out here, which I think is largely why I got so tuned into it. But she was, very sharp, very literary, but I think she chafed a bit. And so that's why when she could, I think the idea of going off to New York City was like, yes,
kind of escape.
It's Mecca.
Yes.
Right. Let me out of here,
Yes.
And although, again, Greenport was really in her veins. And so when my parents divorced, when I was about 14 or 15 years old, she moved back here. Of course, my grandparents had passed away at that point, and moved back into the house in Greenport. And there was never any hesitation. So for her, it was absolutely coming home. And anyway.
But, and then I was curious that you said your parents met in New York City. Was there any problems in terms of religiously?
Oh,
in terms of him being Catholic and her being Methodist, were her parents okay with it?
Yeah, it's even more complicated than that. I fairly recently discovered that my mother had actually been married before she met my father. And she married a guy out here who was from Southold. And I just was able to track down their marriage certificate, which was really fun. But they had a short marriage. So when she met my dad, I would say that there was some disgrace might be too strong a word, but some shame in the fact that she had divorced, you know, at a fairly young age. And there she was, this, you know, independent young woman in New York by herself. My father's Catholicism was very weak.
Okay.
Although his parents, I say that because his mom was a very strong Irish Catholic woman. And, you know, I think she had issues with him being with somebody who had been divorced. And P.S., he also had been in another relationship. And so, you know, he, in many ways, I would say, sort of let go of his Catholic upbringing. And while I was actually baptized here in the Methodist Church in Greenport, it was not a significant part. Religion was not a really significant part of our family, upbringing. Okay. We understood it largely through, you know, Marge and Harry, you know, the Methodism, that Catholicism, you know, because my father really just felt like, no, he also, I think, associated it with a lot of the troubles in Ireland and violence, and honestly, and so, you know, in some ways actively rejected it. But so I don't know how they felt, other than I think that both of my parents were, again, very independent spirits. And, you know, because they had been in these other marriages and, you know, relationships and that kind of thing, there was probably a little bit of standoffishness, you know, on everybody's part, right? I know my Irish grandmother had a hard time even recognizing us kids because we were, in her mind, essentially, you know, like black sheep.
Yeah.
Right. So Marge and Harry weren't like that, believe me. But,
okay. Yeah. And then you said that they would come out here. They were living in New York. They would come out here, but how did it come about that they went? Because you said you were born in Pittsburgh. Yeah. But were they thinking of coming back out to Greenport, or were they looking to go somewhere else?
I think my father was more driven by his work. So after he got in New York at, I think it was Fordham, he got a master's in business because, again, they met when they were in school for social work. As you probably know, social work doesn't pay a lot. And he really was ambitious. You know, I think, again, his early experience in life and watching, you know, and understanding what it meant to grow up super poor, you know, it meant a lot to him. So he got a master's in business, and then it just sort of took off from there. So his first big job offer was in Pittsburgh, and that was with Allegheny Steel when it was still Steeltown.
Wow.
Yeah. And he started out, I think, pretty much right away in labor relations, and that was sort of his stream, you know, out of social work. My mom, you know, pretty quickly just let go of being a social worker. She probably was early on, but she was, if you will, classic sort of housewife. When she moved back here after their divorce, she went back and did her testing and went back into social work. Towards the end of her life, which was sort of neat. Yeah. So she served Suffolk County in Child Protective Services all over the Far East End, and lived out here for, 25 years or so by herself, working and living in the house.
And then, so did you have any other siblings?
Yeah, I'm the youngest.
You're the youngest.
Yeah, okay. So I older brother and an older sister. They were actually they were actually born in New York City. So I was the first one born in Pittsburgh. And then to go back to the Pittsburgh thing, I think, you know, my dad sort of got into the steel industry, I would say sort of at the tail end of its, you know, dominance and, you know, and the whole sort of shift in manufacturing. So he ended up getting an offer, I'm sure he was actively looking, but for a company called Philco Ford. Philco used to be, you know, a consumer sort of electronics. That company ended up morphing into something else. But anyway, that's how we ended up in north of Philly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was all about work.
And how would you say your childhood was growing up in the suburbs of North Philly. What did you do for fun in the
Right.
in the neighborhood or?
Yeah, I mean it's a funny question. I mean, again, because we were allowed to just go out and roam. Again, even there were still woods behind the house where we were, and so we basically we'd be out much of the day, playing out in the woods. I did that. I was a big reader, so I would hang out by myself a good deal. But I feel very, very fortunate in that we were able to be in an environment that we could go out and play. And, there were, we definitely had neighborhood friends. We used to play all kinds of games, kick the can, like get all the kids in the neighborhood together, that kind of thing. And then I started, again, I would say fairly early, probably about 14, babysitting. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And it's so driven. It was so interesting to me. I mean, I've often reflected on that. Like, why was I so driven? Again, I go back to, what I was seeing in front of me. And really, it was all the male influence in my life. My dad and grandpa, who were just such hard workers. And that seemed like, well, that's what I have to do, So anyway, I really took that to heart. But, I wasn't a big sports kid, growing up. So I wasn't one of those who was out, having fun and excelling at, field hockey or something. But I did, all kinds of fun things. Biking was always a huge part of my life. And certainly coming out in Greenport, we were on our bikes all the time. Like that's how we got around. And I still love that. I still feel like it's my independence. Like I get on a bike now and I could be like 13 years old again, you know?
Would you go into Philadelphia at all?
Oh, by myself. Yeah. That I had a big rebellious period as well. We would go in as a family to like the Philadelphia Art Museum on a Saturday. We also had a wonderful tradition for a while there coming into New York, and we would meet Grandma. Harry would never do this, but and go to a Broadway show, Radio City Music Hall. And that was like every Christmas. That was a huge, huge deal. But yeah, we went into Philly, and but it wasn't until I got a little bit older, and I sort of hinted at this. I would go down to Philly by myself on the train. You could do that and just walk the streets. I love that.
How old were you around?
Well, I was probably way too young to be doing it because I was probably 15, 16 years old. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
What, like, how was it? Like, how would you describe Philly or?
Well, it was happening. I mean, you'd go down to Philly and there was music on the streets. There were, again, if I look back on it now, I was probably completely unsafe, but I would do this by myself. I don't know like what I was thinking, but I just wanted to be out there, and I love the urban environment. Again, that's a real split in me, right? But I would listen to music. I would just walk around. I'd smoke cigarettes. I'd meet people on the street. I would look at store windows. I would literally just wander the streets, by myself, and then take the train home.
And then, how was school for you going through elementary, middle school, high school? Was that a good experience? And did you have any specific areas that you gravitated towards in terms of subject matter that you enjoyed?
School, it was like for many kids, I think, very much a mixed bag. I loved reading. I loved writing. I loved history. And I had a really tough time with math. So that was always a major struggle. And then I think by the time I got into junior and then senior high school, I was branching out and trying my hand at pottery and, any of the arts. I was never good, although pottery I loved because it's much more hands-on.
Yeah.
But I really gravitated towards writing and those disciplines that allowed me to think and write, but I struggled mightily with math and science. I mean, I made it through, thank God. but it was hard.
Yeah. And did you know what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
Yeah, no. I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I always marveled at those people who said, I know exactly what I want.
Yeah.
I was, how to put this? I didn't have a firm idea. And again, I'll go back to my experience here, with Grandpa, again, it was so sort of hands-on, and it was, him and the elements and very physical and all of that, which is, I think, why I loved the waitressing also, because you're just out there, working and you could see something happening like right in front of you, right? There was a relationship forming, there was whatever. It was very physically demanding. But, I knew I did not want to be a waitress for the rest of my life. I mean, that was something that, I had that great experience and I was able to say, okay, I want to do something else. I don't know what, and I think, I didn't gravitate towards social sciences or social work, like my mom or dad. But I did learn and feel at a very early age that, helping people in some way was going to be important. And even through college, again, I was in that age still, in going to college when you could go to college and get a liberal arts degree and it meant something, because it was recognized. But I still, when I got out, I floundered around a bit. I went to school. I ended up in the University of California system. So my family is a long line of tradition of leaving, obviously. And I followed that. So I went way the heck out.
To the opposite side.
Opposite coast. But I say all that because, I really fussed. I moved up to San Francisco after I got a BA in politics. From the University of California at Santa Cruz, which was an extraordinary experience. I mean, just talk about mind-blowing on every level. But I got up to San Francisco in the midst of Jim Jones and the assassination of the mayor and Harvey Milk and all of what was going on, 1978. And I did a couple of jobs that were just not right. They were sort of like halfway here in business, and I was like, I don't think so. And fortunately for me, I did I was working a couple of jobs, and I was running a night program teaching English as a second language. And it just opened up a whole universe for me. And anyway, one thing led to another, and I ended up deciding that I really wanted to go into journalism. It wasn't a total fluke. I had been doing work at UC Santa Cruz on the newspaper and all that kind of business. And I loved writing. And all of my professors were like, you need to be writing op-eds. So that resonated with me. And so I went and got a master's at UC Berkeley in journalism. And so it just sort of changed everything. That was the biggest turning point for me. And then I ended up doing an eclectic array of jobs, but journalism, writing has always been a thread, and advocacy in the nonprofit world. So it's led me through a lot of different jobs and positions and experiences in life, that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But
and could you say because you said you had an array of jobs, could you say what you enjoyed the most?
Yeah,
Those?
Easily, my favorite was I was an assistant metro editor at the Savannah Morning News, and the thing I loved about it, again back to just work, right, is that you make a product every day. First of all, I love writing and editing, but there's something really extraordinary about coming out with a daily newspaper, And at that time, it had really good circulation, so. You really understood how the written word in a daily newspaper literally set the agenda and reflected a community. But that's what I love most about it, that, you did it every day, you made something, there was a product, you went, it was done. You got back the next day, you did it again, in addition to just the process and loving learning about community and all of that. I also did a lot of really extraordinary, again, in terms of having experience in the world, advocacy work. And when I lived in Texas for about 10 years and was the executive director of the ACLU of Texas, and then ended up in another organization working with folks who were on death row. And out of that experience, I was a communications support for a program that was assisting folks who were on death row with their appeals. And out of that work, I conceived a project and worked with a colleague of mine from UC Berkeley and produced a book on Texas death row. So we spent a full year on Texas death row, and I negotiated unprecedented access to the row, and it was pretty amazing. So that was in the 90s, mid 90s, when Ann Richards was governor. That would never happen now.
Yeah.
But it was. So I've been, I would say again, very privileged to have these extraordinary opportunities come up, and enough, I guess I would say, confidence in myself to dive in and do them. Again, in retrospect, I don't know that I would do that now, but at the time, things just happened. And so it was nice to be in that position. But another great thing about that book is, again, it is a hard, sort of product. It's something that I helped to create. And, fundamentally, that's something I think that's very important to me. But,
and also your experience as a journalist, are you still working doing that now? Or I was just curious if you had any opinions on how has journalism changed?
Oh God, yeah.
From maybe even the 90s to
it's
now.
Not the same industry at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is really a whole, I will say, rabbit hole. But
we don't have to.
No, it's okay. I would say this. Yeah, the industry is not the same at all. And without sounding cliche, we as a business moved into entertainment, and some of that I think was pushed. I mean, it was pushed by the economics, and it was pushed by the internet, and how we as a society get information, which again we've balkanized now. We're so split. But the idea of just producing a newspaper that helped to try to capture a community and reflect it, and there being a source like that, it's just not even conceivable now. I mean, one of the things I love about being out here is that we still have the Suffolk Times. You can say what you will about, they got that wrong, they got this wrong, but everybody can say that, and that's, people have been saying it since the beginning of time, you know. But the fact is, it's still locally owned, and it's still coming out every week, and telling stories that are really important and reminding us to think about, our world here on the East End in ways that probably many people might not otherwise, right? Because otherwise, what are you doing? You're looking at Facebook where people are sniping at each other. I don't even go there. I can't do it.
The whole social media thing
it's become a mess.
It's totally a mess. And
right.
And I think it is important to have still some, because a lot of those local independent newspapers have disappeared in other parts, and they just rely on the mainstream news, which doesn't, it's more, I guess you could say it's more generic, but you don't get as much local stuff on that area, and it's just this broad thing. So people kind of, I think, are not interested in that so as much, because they might not be focusing locally. And then when you do go online, it's just very biased in certain ways.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not giving you just the neutral news in a way, and people can go to their own, and then they're kind of isolated in their own little bubble of news.
Right. It's driven more, the social media is driven more by people's opinions, and they may use some stories as a launching pad, but without, questioning or really finding out, is that even true? There's no discernment, there's no judgment. Forget the civility thing. I won't, again, but it is largely just opinion and people making snide remarks about one another and being too smart for words, The other paper I just want to shout out here, I think it's extraordinary, is Beth Young, what she's doing with the East End Beacon. She's a fairly young woman, and she is pretty much doing that by herself.
Yeah.
She is remarkable as far as I'm concerned, and everybody should be supporting that paper, and her work online, because she's out there every day, and she's got to be doing it 7 days a week to be doing what she's doing. But, and again, you could critique, the product and the this and the that, but she still is, again, very locally focused and trying to ensure that she's out there at meetings that, if you're not covering local meetings here, that's where it all happens. In these small, difficult, tedious meetings, right?
Yes.
Right. But that's democracy. And, if you're not out there covering that, people wouldn't know what's happening. And decisions are made. And then they're all of a sudden going like, oh, my God, how did that happen? Whatever.
Yes.
But again, in comparison to the social media, that's hyper local. I mean, oftentimes it comes right down to, my block.
Yes.
My 3 blocks, how mad I am about XYZ, whatever it might be. And that's great. I mean, I don't disparage that, I guess I would say, focus. It's just, again, it's so personal. It's and not about trying to get to any measure of what's true.
And then just to switch a bit, you also, I think you mentioned that you moved back to Greenport. What year was that?
Well, I first moved back full-time in around 1999, and I was here for about 4.5 years or so. And it was after my mom had passed away, so my husband and I worked on the house, which was great, and I did a number of things here. I was a consultant with a project called the Sustainable East End Development Strategies, or SEEDS, and that was very fun. It was trying to get all 5 towns and all of our hamlets and villages to work collaboratively on a land use and transportation initiative, which I would say was marginally successful, but it was really extraordinary work, and I got to connect with people literally from the south side to the north, and my specific job was communications and public engagement, so I was literally like every one of the charrettes, running them, and it was great. It was really, really fun. I also worked for a little bit for Southampton College. It was still Southampton College at the time, in their media public relations department. That was part-time. Again, back to the Greenport story, you piece together work here in life, and that's the only way you can do it traditionally. So I also worked at the old Verbena, which used to be owned by Rachel Macieres. It was a great little store. So I did a bunch of different things and worked on the house and tried to find more about my family history. So that was very fun when I had free time to do that. And I was doing some writing at the time. So yeah, so I was here for a bit, and then
could you describe a little bit how the area felt at that time in the well, that was the late 90s and
early 2000s, right? It was really interesting because there's some friends of mine, people that I got to know then that I did not know earlier, many of whom had been more recent folks who moved to the area. There are people here who sort of refer to that as a golden time, because there was a lot of vibrant activity around the arts and I would say even writing. But, there was a real sense of opening, and there were many, many artists, younger artists, who had come out here mostly, I'm sure, from the city, and they were out here pretty much full time, not part time, because, artists typically don't have that kind of income, to be able to do that. But they really infused a great, I would say, both creative and vibrant spirit, that was wonderful to see. And it was before the real estate went crazy. So you still had people who could be here and live, reasonably well. Housing has always been pricey out here, but it was not crazy. So once again, like many of the artists I know, they were making art and they were doing, something else for money. But that's true all over, But at any rate, that was, it was wonderful. There was a real sense of community. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And that was powerful. And just sideways, I had a personal connection to that, like many, many, many people. But because of the work I was doing with Seeds, which was MTC sponsored and funded, the people I was working with directly were in the World Trade Center when that happened. And it, of course, changed their lives and everything that, and all of us out here were hit. Greenport is, there were many, many, many direct connections, and most people in Greenport have New York City connections. They almost always have. So at any rate, all of that was happening. It was a really charged. So we went from, I feel, a very open, like anything is possible moment to 9/11, which shut down the country in many ways. But yeah.
And then could you talk a little bit? You said you had done or gotten involved with the library a little bit at that time. Could you discuss some of the things that were happening?
Yeah, it was really fun. I was just, I was really tangential, but I was part of it was a wonderful, active film committee with fabulous people on it. And we would get together and everybody would bring different ideas about what films we wanted to bring. And again, this is, when we're all still maybe looking at video cassettes, right? But bringing in, very different films, independent and foreign and this and that. And it was great fun. We would show them here in the basement in the library, and everybody would get together afterwards and go out to a bar and hang out and talk movie. And so that was super fun. I also just, I just was, I would say the library, Floyd has always been a community center in the best sense of how that can work, I think. And at that time, it truly was also. That was before this other parcel of land was purchased. But, there were all these great ideas about, how to expand and, just continue to build community, and a lot of good art being shown. I took a wonderful class here offered by a local guy. I'm not even sure if he's still alive or with us, but he taught a great class on genealogy. Obviously he was a, if you will, amateur himself. But this is, again, pre-ancestry.com, or, it probably was just starting to emerge, but, we weren't in that, because it was a different tool, I think, early on, and it's really evolved. But he was fabulous, and he taught me a lot about, looking at resources. So that was a big part of the library. So I also took a conversational Spanish class here, which I failed at miserably, but it was delightful. And the teacher, who was a native Spanish speaker, she was wonderful. So the library, first of all, has always been a huge part of my life here. From the time I was a kid, we went here in the summer and got all our books, and, and that's when it was mostly, a traditional library, right? Yes. But then, even coming back again in 99 and then being here, we would get all of our movies here. The VCR collection was fabulous. Yes. So what you would do is come on a Friday afternoon and spend like an hour looking at all and find, just like the beauty of a library, you go to the stacks, and you get to find things that you didn't even know about, So anyway, it was great fun. It's always been, I'd say, a focal point, you know.
And then, so you stayed in Greenport for a bit, and then you moved
to Savannah.
And did you move to another state?
Yeah, I did. So I was in Savannah. My husband and I were in Savannah for about 13 years. Much of that time I worked for the newspaper, and then I got a job as a director of an anti-poverty organization called Step Up Savannah, which was a great collaborative. So we were there for a while, and then my husband's mom started to have some serious health issues. He is from the Midwest, so we moved to St. Paul to help with her end-of-life care. Just to close that loop, my last job was at the city of St. Paul as a communications and marketing professional for the city. So, but we were there for about 5 years helping with her, and she passed away, and then made that, well, not then, but, in the last couple of years of being there, made the decision to come back to Greenport. So we moved back in here in the fall of 2022.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And how has it been coming back in 2022? So you weren't here during COVID and...
Correct.
So coming back after, did you see even more change?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. On a very personal level, what's fascinating to me is, walking, even in my neighborhood, it's funny the way the mind and memory works. It's almost as though I'm still seeing things, as I did when I was a kid, right? And much of the landscape itself has not changed. Part of the beauty in some ways of Greenport is that its housing stock is old and it's pretty much still the same. And the streets still have bad sidewalks.
Yeah.
But again, physically, this most significant change I've seen is the rising sea level. That's very alarming. And what's happening, the impacts that are occurring as a result of climate change are very, I would say, unnerving. And Greenport really is, in many ways, a target on that.
Yes.
But yeah, I would say that it feels different in many ways. And that is in part because so many people have had to leave, because of the affordability issue. And people choose to leave too, because, at some point you have sort of I would say almost like a cultural tipping point where people start to feel like, well, is this the same Greenport that I love and grew up in? And the answer is not really. Right.
And do you, well, I guess it's probably a typical question, but do you miss anything about the way it used to be? Or is there some things that, obviously some people say no, and then some people say, yeah, I kind of miss some things, but I think other things have improved for the better.
Right.
But I don't know if there's anything that sticks out to you that you think there's something that you miss.
Yeah, I would say that I do feel the loss of the sense of community that made this village, that made up sort of the fabric of this village when I was growing up. Those kinds of evolutions, it's happening all over. That is not, if you will, unique to Greenport, but when you're in a teeny village like this, the reverberations are a lot more profound. And so I would say that I certainly miss that sense of deep-rooted connection. I have not yet, while I've been here, been through a major natural disaster yet, but we all know that's coming, at any minute. I don't know what that's going to feel like here, because that's really where any community where you really get sort of tested.
And if they come together.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But, I think that what I appreciate about Greenport now is it does feel like there are some good, compassionate, well-meaning people trying to find solutions to hold on to what they have and to maybe make it better. Because, just the idea of, oh, let's just hold on and keep this in some kind of a time capsule is not going to work. I mean, that part of it, that thinking is not, none of us, think of a village as an organism, right? We have to keep growing and changing. So how you do that is where where it really gets hard, but it's so important to try to do that with intention. And again, I would say we're a small enough community that we can do that here. So I certainly, and I personally spend a lot of time volunteering for the village, doing work on various committees for them, because I feel deeply committed to helping to shape where we can go, to the extent that, one person can, help out. But I really feel very strongly about, spending time. And I think it's important for everybody to dive in and not, frankly, just be sitting on the outside pointing fingers at, what are you going to do? Village. Like, no, This is us, kids, right? We all have to be in this together, making it happen. So.
And like, now that you've been here and been involved in the community, are there you mentioned sea level rise, but are there any other maybe 2 or 3 issues that you feel are important that the community's facing right now that we should be focusing on, or or they are focusing on, but you feel is important?
Yeah, I think, in terms of climate change, that has, again, so many ramifications, but one piece of that absolutely has to do with development and how we're permitting it to occur or not. So, getting our handle on planning for that, and the sort of adaptation strategies that we devise are really important, because it's a foundational piece. We're not going to be here if if this continues. And I say that not in an alarmist way. It's just a matter of fact. And it's really like a matter of 50 years. So you're just not going to have these opportunities if you don't sort of stop allowing the kinds of development that have led to this or helped, right? On the other hand, Greenport as a village certainly can't stop rising sea level. All we can do is figure out the right adaptation and mitigation strategies. So I think that's a really foundational piece. It's our environment. It's the very, the land and the water. But, what is the point if you're not caring for your people? Right? So I think, ensuring that we have the appropriate housing stock for all kinds of families to be here, from rent to rooming houses, for God's sake, to, affordable ownership opportunity. And again, I would say the village and the town are really trying hard to figure out legal and appropriate responses to that, in the face of a very strong, private property rights kind of pressure, which is really hard. And again, the more money that comes in, the more challenging that is to argue with. Those are not, it gets more and more difficult.
Especially, with the, like you said, with the housing, it's, and the property, the rise in property, and it's hard to regulate and kind of control people's private property in some ways. We want to zone this for this, and we don't want this developed for a subdivision. But I don't know if there's some differences, because I think, I don't know about the United States had a different form of development compared to some other countries, especially in Europe, with the wide open land. But I think for us, especially in the Northeast, things are more tight in some ways. And I think you see that in Europe, they have been able to kind of build more compact, close together, and keep the open lands for the most part. And I don't know if that's through the government and the way that's run from the state or the federal, but for the north end, I think it's going to be a tough thing in the future, especially with the farming and other areas struggling to keep that land the way it is. Can we keep that open space while still providing housing to people and do it in a sustainable way that's not just, okay, we can build a bunch of housing out in the middle of a farm area, but it's somewhat still isolating people in this development. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's again, I don't want to be glib about this. The challenges are really, really layered and very, very complex. So and because we, and I include myself in this, we've grown up in a culture of this idea that the single family home is the answer, and it's the dream, it's the aspiration, and that involves a little piece of land, that's mine, right? The difference in Europe, it's multi-tiered. I mean, the kinds of differences, and some of it may even be somewhat cultural. We here in the U.S. largely, unless we're in a city, see density as some kind of evil. And some of that may have its roots in tenement, upbringing and that kind of thing, apartments. But how to sort of shift that mindset is really a big hurdle. I have the great benefit of having lived in, many different communities and all over this country. And I have no problems with, density, and on my block even. And, people have always, there's this sort of crazy divide I've never understood between renters and owners, as if people who rent are somehow, less concerned about where they live. I rented almost my entire life, I just happened to be, again, in a deeply fortunate position where my family home, which my grandfather bought that land for $100. It's been in my family for 3 generations. There is no way that we could be back here now living in that place if we had to buy it. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but the point is I have that piece and it will not be sold. But I can see how people who have spent their whole lives working 2 and 3 jobs in a tough place here, feeling like they are more and more marginalized and not able to make the money even to pay the, what it takes to be here, just housing alone, say, well, heck, I'd be an idiot not to take this 1.5 million, right? For a place that, we've been in for, who knows how long and blah, blah, blah. So I get it. But how you find the right sort of public supports and tax credits, and there are, creative policy solutions to this, but it definitely takes that combination of being able to do the hard work of researching and having the institutional mechanisms to take advantage of things like low-income tax credits and on, which is a whole world, in the housing universe. That, and then starting to help the shift in understanding of that our neighbors, if they live in duplex or, God forbid, multi-family housing, they're not less than us. And, they are part of our family here, right? And, they're, so how you do that is really hard, and I think it requires a lot of very hard and real conversations, for one thing, because what you see here is well-meaning people saying, yes, I support that. But the minute it's near them, people run around like their hair's on fire.
Mm-hmm.
That can't happen here. No. I'm all for it, but not there, and here's why. And they come up with elaborate reasons about why it can't happen on their block.
Mm-hmm.
So, these are very thorny questions, and at some point, some of these decisions and changes just have to happen, regardless of how much people sue each other and scream, because that will happen.
Yes. And was there another issue you could think about that?
Right.
That you...
Yeah, I guess, the only thing I don't even know how to frame this. I would say this, though. I think that it's really important to go back to this issue of how Greenport continues to evolve. It's important for us to embrace change as well, because if we don't, what we're in risk of, I think, is simply Greenport becoming frozen in time as some kind of a quote-unquote quaint fishing village, which it isn't anymore. And it becomes like a Disney theme park. Here's the backdrop, downtown Greenport. This looks like a bunch of cute shops.
Like old wooden shacks.
Right, right.
I feel like some people have said, well, they should try, preserving the buildings, I get, and if you wanted to keep the architecture the same, but you don't want to look like a Disney theme park. And St. Augustine in Florida is another example. I think they've kind of balanced it out, but it does have the little trolley going around, and
right.
There's some other towns like that in the U.S., and I think it loses its character even more so because it just is just stopped in time, and you kind of lose the community aspect. You just have tourists coming through, taking photos, and I don't know. Then you just have people. You have people here that would only be here in the summer. Then I think even more so, and you lose more of the full-time residents, and it's just operates a part of the year.
Yeah, I watched that in the 13 years I was in Savannah, Georgia, and it became the Southern wedding venue capital.
Yes.
And it made everybody in Savannah crazy, because it became like just a bunch of facades for people who were coming in from all over the country with no connection to the South at all, nor P.S. do they understand the cultural history of Savannah, Georgia. It was awful to watch, and it's very hard to grab onto in terms of as a journalist to write well and compellingly about that and about those stories and how those things happen, and to sort of deconstruct. Because, I'd say we're in it right now here in Greenport. And I think our newspapers are trying to grasp at that, give a description. They're not quite doing it, but, it's an important goal. But at any rate, it's a real problem. So I guess I would put that broadly in the frame of, cultural community and, how we hold on to who we are and embrace that. And
like you said, the something that you feel that you miss with is some of the community. And do you think some of that is in regards to the social media now, and that people are so closed in their certain window of their feeds, and they might go to these events, but they don't interact with as many people unless you're going to these events or you're involved in the community. You're just going to be focused on or isolated in your own world. You're living in Greenport, but you're isolated with your own events on your phone. Or so I don't know if that, because I feel like that's probably all over the world
right
now, just with how people can be so isolated but then so connected with the world at the same time?
Well, they're not really, I would argue they're not really connected with the world. They imagine they are.
Yeah.
And, I know there are people who are not in Greenport full time, but feel like they're connected because they're on various social media sites. Oh, I know what's going on. No, you don't. Sorry. Right? What you know is a feed that happens to have you got because of the algorithm system that social media promotes, that you get exactly what you want.
It's a curated.
Right. So you're only hearing what you need to hear because that's what you've put into your phone, basically. I mean, I'm reducing this to ridiculousness, but yes, people are very isolated. And I think that absolutely contributes. Again, we still have, I think, enough physical connection to one another here in Greenport because, again, we're like a teeny space.
we should
right?
be able to.
Right. Yeah, come on. Like, just reach out and touch each other, instead of snidely remarking and slapping one another. But at any rate, it is all over, and that is here in Greenport. I like to think that it doesn't totally define, our, if you will, social community here. And I really don't think it does. I think people are still about connecting here. But there is a whole sort of strain, that's in what I call the ether world, right? And as I said, I mean, I literally choose not to be in there, but I have enough friends that are like, oh my God, you should see what, this strain. And they'll, send me screenshots of whatever. I'm like, no, I can't.
It's not,
there's not enough time in my life. Right? Right.
And kind of just lastly, we kind of touched about it already, but just kind of what you hope for the Greenport and the community down the line.
I guess I would say that, we're able to come together, as a community and work to ensure that our environment is going to be here in some recognizable form so that we can continue to have this beautiful village and this space, and that we engage in some of these very, very hard conversations that we need to have about what it's going to take to be here and to care for each other and to create the kinds of housing opportunities and economic opportunities that will support a thriving community that cares.
Just like to ask, is there anything else you'd like to discuss or say that we haven't talked about?
No.
No.
I don't think so.
Okay. So thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast and telling your story, and thank you for your involvement, continued involvement in Greenport and helping push important topics and keeping that discussion going in our community.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I really, again, I appreciate Floyd Memorial Library endlessly. But I think you're doing a great job. And I think this is a nice tribute to the village that you're doing the podcast.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 36 with Suzy Donovan. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.